this title, the reason I did is because I was reading. You know, I read a lot. Whether you believe it, I read a lot. I'm going to tell you some of the other things I read a little bit later today, but I was reading in Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Effective People. He says there are 7 habits of effective people. One of his habits, he says, is that my mind? Yes. Okay. He says one of them is that people need to start with the end in mind. So that's one of the habits. Matter of fact, in the book he writes, he says that he was going to a funeral. He said, imagine if you were going to a funeral, and when you walk into a funeral, you can imagine how the people would feel sorry for the person that was laying in the casket. He said, imagine yourself walking down the aisle, looking at familiar faces that you've known. He says, you walk up to the casket, you take a look in. In the book, he says, what you see is yourself. He says, you see you in the casket. He says, and what you see, and on the program, you take a seat, you look on the program, you look around, and you says, on the program, there are going to be 4 speakers. One is going to be your family. One's going to be your friends. One's going to be your co-workers. One's going to be someone from the church. It says in the book, he says, what do you think they would come up and say about you? What would they say about your life and how it's been lived? What would those people come up and say? What would your family come up and say about you? As far as being a husband, a wife, a son or a daughter, a mother or a father. What would they say about you? Because your family would have to say something. What would your friends say about you? What would they say the kind of friend you were to them? What would they say how you treated them? What would your co-workers say about you as far as your character? What would they say, I know this person and their character, and it stands up head and shoulders above everyone else. But then what about your church? Matter of fact, if you would look around to your left or to your right and you would look, what would these people say about you? Would they say you've impacted their life in any way? Would they say you touched their heart? What would these people say about you? See, but if we're living with the end in mind, and we're thinking along those terms, see, we won't be surprised when the time is up. Because sooner or later, it's going to be, the time has to expire. So the question becomes, are you going to be surprised or caught off guard when you're living your life? Because we all have to go by way of death sooner or later. One day, sooner or later, it's going to tap us on the shoulder and tell us to come on in. And when it does, if you're surprised and you haven't lived your life with that end concept in mind, you might have done some way you regret. You look back later and say, I wish I had behaved that way or operated that way. You know, I read about a taxi driver. Give me some of my readings again. I read about a taxi driver. Picked up a passenger, driving down the road. Passenger tapped him on the shoulder. Hey, buddy. He all of a sudden jumped, screamed. Car ran off the curb, almost hit the vehicle. He stopped. Didn't say anything. Taxi driver didn't say anything. Passenger didn't say anything. Taxi driver looked back and said, you scared the daylights out of me. Passenger said, if I knew just tapping you on the shoulder would scare you like that, I had no way of knowing. Driver said, what is it? He said, I've been driving a hearse for 25 years. This is my first day on the job. Scared him, you know. You might get that joke a little later when you get home. But the point is, you know, we don't want to be surprised by the events of life. Right. We don't want to be surprised by death when it comes up and taps us on the shoulders. And we're going to learn and glean from the examples that Paul has laid out for us here in Philippians. Because we have here a writer who is spending his last days in jail in a Philippian prison writing and looking back at his life through a rearview mirror. He's going, how did I live my life? And he wants to give us some of those principles that we can live. He's looking through the rearview mirror. He's looking out the front of where he's going. And if you missed a class this morning, let me say this, you missed a good class. You missed a good class. So if you guys don't remember to come to the class at 8:30. It's a very, very good class. But he's looking out there. And he's saying, how can then we live our lives with the end in mind? First thing I'm going to tell you is this. In our private life, we need to know God. in our private life. Now, if you want to live your life with the end in mind, the first thing you got to come to grips with is that in your private life, you got to want to know God. See, why? Because there is so much to be gained. You say, well, how is that the case? Well, I'm going to tell you. The same way Paul tells us in Philippians 3. Look in verse number 7. He says, but whatever things were to gain to me, those things I've counted as loss for the sake of Christ. And I'm going to pull in verse 8. Now, verse 8, remember, 8 through 11 is a single sentence in the Greek vernacular. So when you see this, he's going to bring in verse 8. It's only a glimpse of what he's talking about in verse 7. He begins to build. It's a building type sentence. So, okay, verse 8. He says, more than that, I count all things to be lost in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I've suffered the loss of all things. I count them but rubbish, so that in the end that I may gain Christ. Number 7 is a very parallel sentence, meaning this. He tells us that he wants to gain something, and he puts it in the plurality form. But he puts the word loss in the singular. You can't necessarily see that in your English vernacular. But what I'm telling you is this. Paul is saying the things that I once gained, i.e. that which was in verse number 6, the fact that I was circumcised, the fact that I was a Hebrew of Hebrew, all of these things, the fact that I was the law, the fact that I carried out persecution, he says all of these things, the plurality of them, no matter how many they are, that you can look at in your life, no matter what you gain, how great it is, your accomplishments, your education, all the things you've done in your life, Paul says, well, in the end, I count all of that as a singular thing, i.e. one loss. Paul says, basically what I'm telling you, everything that I've gained, I'm willing to put in a single box and throw overboard. He said, because it basically means nothing to me. So he's using a parallel sentence saying, on one hand, I have all these gains. On the other hand, I have a singular loss. And matter of fact, what you might not be able to understand in the text is written from an accounting perspective. That's what's so great about his writing. Unless you can see it in the vernacular, you can't necessarily tell what he's trying to say, but we're going to try to flush this thing out. He's writing in the plurality of gains, but the singularity of losses. But he's writing with a parallel sentence here, saying that I've gained, but I'll take a single loss for the sake of Christ. For a single point. He's saying Christ is greater than everything I've gained to this point. He said no matter what I've gained, I'm going to tell you this. All as a singular loss in order that I can have Christ. Now he's saying, look, what I'm telling you, he's saying in my private life, I want to know God. Why? Because in God, there's gain. Look at verse 8. He's saying, I can gain so much from the fact that I've counted everything as lost for the sake of Christ, but more than that, I count all things to be lost in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus. Now let me tell you, he's saying, right here, he's saying, what I know is I'm that I've gained, putting it in a box, throwing it overboard as a singular loss, and he's saying, what I have now is the knowledge of Christ Jesus. Now what I want you to keep this in mind. Because when he uses the word knowing here, he's using it from a perspective of saying it's something secret that I have that you don't have. Right. You say, well, what's so important about that? Because he's going to use the same word a little bit later, but he's going to use it differently. And we're going to press that home in just a minute. So Paul is saying, look, in my private life, what I want to do is I want to know God because there is way too much to gain. And he said, the fact that I can gain so much by knowing God, I'm willing to give up, relinquish, give away anything else because I found it does not bring me the same type of joy as knowing one single thing, and that's Christ. He said one single thing, Christ, overrides everything else there is to have. He said, that's why, he said, there's so much to be gained to have Christ in your private life. The fact that you know Christ in your private life, there is so much more that can be gained. And Paul says, as a matter of fact, he says, it is like rubbish. Everything else is like rubbish. And you know what that is? That's excrement. When you bring that out, that means it's excrement, dung, as you might say. Now, and the only way I can probably explain that is because my grandmama, see, I'm going to tell you about my grandma. You know, I told you I grew in the East Texas, grew up in them woods. And in them woods, you see things, you do things that other people may not do when they're in the city. Now, one of the things my grandmama would do is when you were sick, she would make two kinds of tea. You get 1 or 2 cups of tea. You get the hot toddy. That's my favorite. I like the hot toddy. I was all right with that one. Now the other one you get was the cow chip tea. You might not even know what that is. You might not even know what that is. Cow chip tea. And I know it was cow chip tea. I went with my uncle. We were going to pasture. And so we would pick up the cow. He knew how to pick out the right chip too. I was like, I wasn't drinking no cow chip tea. I knew for a fact I was turning my nose. There's no way my grandmama gonna give me cow chip tea. Now cow chip tea was made out of the dung of cow. Now she would make that. I did not drink it. I would turn my nose up, and there's no way, big mama, you're going to get me to drink that. Now, when I went to go down to my grandmama's, it would be on the weekend, and I said, I try not to get sick. I try to hold every cough in. Because I didn't want, and if I did, big mama would say, all right, go on back there, get in that bed, I'm going to bring you some tea. I'd be, oh, Lord, what tea coming back? I'm sitting there back there waiting. Oh, gosh, oh, God, don't bring the cow chip. I'm not drinking. And they come back there, my brothers. They go back there with that little tea. Tim, we got some tea. I believe they knew it was cow chip a couple times. I'd ask, hey, is this that cow chip that mom be making? Or is the hot toddy? They went, we ain't saying that. They don't want to tell me. I was like, don't have brothers. I tell you right now, don't have brothers. You got in and get rid of them. You don't want these brothers. They wouldn't tell me. They wouldn't tell me what it was. But I could tell later which one it was. Because I knew if it was the hot toddy. I'd be laying up in that bed, all the lyrics of the Sugar Hill Gang. I knew them all then. I didn't have to be here last week for that. See, I knew them all then. I'd be hip, hop, hitting my toes, be doing it. Because Big Mom made it strong. Boy, I like that. That was my favorite one. But I turned my nose up to the cow chip. See, what Paul is saying is that, hey, everything else in his life, he would turn his nose up to. It was rubbish. He didn't want it. Wasn't worth having. He said, it meant nothing to me. He says, I gained education. I gained all